share rather unusual experience I had. And I was talking to a friend of mine this morning, a fellow member of the MPOD 11 cohort. And I was trying to frame up the opening for this little talk. And she said something so smart that I was compelled to write it down. So here you go. Sometimes life unfolds in a way that demonstrates theory. We go along through life divorced from theory because it's not convenient, in the same way reality is not convenient. That's what your story is about. So yes, that's what my story is about. Thank you, Janelle Coleman. That's about as good as intro as anything I could come up with to just set the stage for how a brain tumor taught me about learning. I'm going to start with a lot of spoilers. First of all, I'm fine. I'm still processing so much of this experience, which is very new and exhilarating in a really odd way. So let's just jump right in, and I will talk about this inconvenient reality, as Janelle so wisely put it.
Barbara, before you get started, your PowerPoint has seemed to disappear. You might need to reshare it.
Yeah, I will start it off. You're not going to see, let's see, where did it go? There it is.
Perfect.
There you go. So I only have a few slides. Another spoiler is I figured out, with the help of some folks whose names I will mention a little bit later, that what this story is really about, it's really about how, what I've learned about learning, I guess I could say. I am very interested in experiential learning theory, and I'm taking a course right now, a certification course with Kay Peterson and David and Alice Kolb on experiential learning, the learning cycle and learning styles. And I'm really excited about it. And so anyway, I can see so many links between what's gone on since I landed in the hospital on January 3rd of this year with the unexpected news that I had a rather large tumor covering my right ventricle. So about 6 days later, when I had had surgery, in fact, it was 2 days after surgery that I was released, one of my sisters said to me, "I can't believe how positive you've been through this whole thing." And I said, well, you know, I'm highly trained. I went through grad school to learn how to be positive. And I was making light conversation at the time, but in fact, I very, very clearly was thinking about what I'd learned during MPOD, and I marshaled some of that learning to get through 6 rather uncomfortable days in the ICU. But just to back up a little bit for anybody who might be on the webcast that doesn't know what MPOD is, MPOD stands for Master of Science in Positive Organization Development. It's a wonderful program offered by Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management. I'm part of the MPOD 11 cohort. I'm hearing a little bit of a reverb. I don't know if that's coming.
I think some people are unmuting themselves. If you are watching the presentation, make sure to keep yourself muted so there's not an echo. When Barbara's finished with the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. Sorry for the interruption, Barb.
No worries. Thank you for figuring that out. So anyway, if you've been through the MPOD program, you probably feel, as I feel like I do and many of my cohort do, it's not just something you go through and then you leave or it leaves you. It's something that you keep with you and you build on. And I know in my case, it's a part of my identity. So it's just a remarkable program. And if you want to learn more about it, there'll be a link at the end of this presentation. So I graduated from the program in 2016. And as soon as I graduated, I embarked on, well, I had been working as a management consultant with a global business advisory firm, a great firm, but I really wanted to go out on my own and do things my way. And so I left shortly after I graduated, and I got busy right away doing my consulting work for clients, mostly in energy and manufacturing. And I was working on some passion projects at the same time. I was traveling around to see family because it's really nice to be able to work from anywhere when you're not on site with your clients. Very involved with a very large family. And so a lot of that, I think, is why I missed the signs that I had something going on in my brain. And piecing it together after I had the diagnosis and when I came out of recovery, there was a lot to sift through. And I realized that the symptoms were really apparent starting in about the July of 2018. It started with severe headaches, which I'm not necessarily prone to, that got progressively worse as the year went on. And around about October, I felt very, very much a darkening of my mood, which is characteristic apparently of this kind of tumor. It wasn't like it was all of a sudden that I felt kind of suppressed, but it's something that slips kind of over time. And it's like a lot of things when you lose something in small degrees, it can be a very precipitous slide and you don't really realize what's going on or what you've lost until you've gotten pretty far. And in my case, I was traveling a lot. I was working really hard on a lot of different things, and feeling progressively kind of worse, but too busy to deal with it. I would just parachute into whatever urgent care clinic I could find in whatever town I happened to be in. So by mid-December, things had gotten pretty acute. I was aware of feeling really disconnected from people, the people I was close to, my family, even my beloved granddaughters. I didn't realize that my family was seeing something that was even more alarming to them. What they were witnessing was a flatlining of my personality. My son started worrying about Alzheimer's. I guess my speech patterns started to slow. My affect was just dull and off. I'm still working. I'm still traveling around. And it was kind of crazy. I was about to board a plane. I was in Florida working on a new project. I was about to board a plane home when I realized I was too sick to travel. So stepped out, went to an urgent care clinic, was diagnosed with a bacterial infection that was a result of taking like 3 or 4 different rounds of antibiotics. And so a few days later, I'm home getting treated. And I called up a friend of mine from grad school, another MPOD 11 cohort member, my friend Martha. And I was really in a bad place. I didn't kind of know what to do. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I wasn't thinking clearly enough to know I wasn't thinking clearly. And I just told Martha that I was scared and I was nervous and I didn't know what to do. And she said, in a very firm tone, start with gratitude. Talk to your white blood cells. That's your little army. They're going to come to your aid. So start by thanking them and start by being grateful to them. Anyway, she talked me through it, and I kind of seized on that as something that I could do, a way that I could take control when I was feeling very out of control. And it was a conversation I remembered later when I was hospitalized. So by New Year's Eve, I had flown to Pensacola to ramp up on this big project. It was a merger acquisition. And I was really excited about it. It was going to be the focus of my year. But on the second day, when I emerged from the hotel, which was about a half an hour from the client's office building, I couldn't figure out how to get to the office building. And it's a walk I had done before a couple of times. It's not like it was complicated, but I emerged from the hotel just feeling really confused. So I pulled it up on my map on my phone and I couldn't figure out how to read the map. Anyway, to make a long story short, I told the client that I felt like I needed to get home. I just really wasn't feeling well. And when I was flying home, I had to connect through the Charlotte airport. And on the way through the airport from the flight where I landed to my connecting gate to DC, I fell down 3 times. Finally, a skycap rushed over with a wheelchair, wheeled me to the gate. I got to DC, waved off the wheelchair that was waiting for me, got in my car, and drove the hour to my sister's house. I didn't want to go home. At least I had the sense not to go home. But by this time, she'd been talking to my brother in Colorado and my son, and they had all conspired to have her take me to the emergency room in the morning. I don't remember much about the next morning. All I remember saying was, okay, I'll go, but I'm not going to stay overnight. I'm not going to let them put an IV in, because I have this thing where if you stick an IV in me and you hook me up to a drip, I know I'm about to lose my independence. So anyway, the next thing I remember, I'm being told, well, you have a rather large tumor in your brain. I don't remember having the CAT scan. I don't remember much about the admissions process. The next thing I really remember was being gowned up in the hospital room with the IV. And I guess the medical team at the hospital was fantastic. And they immediately started pumping me full of IV steroids to shrink the tumor and put me on some kind of an anti-seizure medication. But it was the steroids that, I mean, it was like the light flooded back in. All of a sudden, it was like I could think again. And in the span of about 4 hours, my family went from feeling pretty devastated to feeling amazed that I was back. So it was pretty exciting, even though I had this thing in my head. So it was a lesion that was covering my right ventricle. It was pushing my brain across the midline of my face. I guess I was pretty close to having seizures and worse. So I had no idea when I first got there just how critical things were. I did what I am prone to do in a situation where I don't feel like I have a lot of control and I'm a little nervous. I started cracking jokes. So I got on social media. I've moved a lot in the past 15 years. And so I have these little tribes of friends in different states. And I wanted just to let everybody know all in one fell swoop what was going on. And I wanted to kind of marshal the support system that I had. My family was being fantastic, and they were already strategizing for who was going to be with me around the clock to make sure I was getting the care I needed. But anyway, I went onto Facebook and just started interacting with folks and making jokes to try to get through the first few hours when I was still trying to sift out what was going on. So I'm pretty sure the steroids factored pretty prominently in my feeling kind of energized, well, very energized. Now my mind was racing, and I started to turn my thoughts toward some kind of a plan to get through to the surgery. I was admitted on a Thursday. The plan was to do surgery on a Monday when the tumor had had time to shrink, or the steroids had had time to take effect. I felt really confident in the medical care I was getting. The surgeon, Dr. Jay Lim, was fantastic. So those things being taken care of, some critical decisions having been made, I wanted to make my own little plan. I don't like feeling out of control. I wanted to put on a good face for my family. And I just wanted to do what I could to kind of set myself up for a successful surgery. I made a conscious decision to embrace denial. I figured it was going to be some time before I had a full diagnosis with pathology and all that. So as long as I could assume the best, I was going to do that. That was a conscious decision I made. But this is where learning theory kind of kicks in. I didn't realize at the time what I was doing was I was starting a trip around the experiential learning cycle. So those of you who are familiar with it, and I think many of you on the webcast probably are, you recognize this diagram as coming from the experiential learning cycle that David Kolb and Alice Kolb have researched and worked with, and Kay Peterson and David co-authored this fantastic book, How You Learn is How You Live, which is something I am studying again in a certification course. So when I first committed to this webcast, I thought I was going to be talking about positivity, because one of the first things that came to my mind was one way to try to put something healthy in my brain and maybe counteract the crazy things that were going on was to put some positivity in there. I mean, I know that neuroscience is, has got a lot to say about emotional intelligence. And I was trying to remember what I might take from grad school to at least get through the next few days. So I'm starting out in this cycle of learning. And as I think a lot of you know, the north and south parts of this diagram show how we take in information. So there are ways of knowing the world through concrete experience and abstract thinking. The east and west, reflective observation and active experimentation, are ways that we transform what we're taking in to create the learning. So I'm going to quote directly from the book, How You Learn is How You Live, these key points about the learning cycle. So it's using all 4 steps of the learning cycle that leads to full cycle learning. Full cycle learners touch all the bases: experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting in an ongoing process that adapts to what is being learned and in what environment. And the most important aspect of the learning cycle is that it describes the learning process as an ongoing spiral that leads to new experiences. I think another key point I'd like to make at this point is we are not passive recipients of the information. This is not something that somebody ginned up because it sounds cool and intellectual. This is a natural cycle, and I think my experience really demonstrates how it works. I jumped into it instinctively. I certainly wasn't thinking about it at the time. I wasn't intentionally planning to take a trip around the learning cycle. I just did. So embedded in the learning cycle are these 9 styles of learning. I won't describe them in detail. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for that. I'll just say that our learning style simply describes our dominant way of navigating around the learning cycle. And it's not a fixed state. I mean, it's not a fixed trait, but a state. And that's something that I'll demonstrate later on as well. So when I first took the Kolb Learning Style Inventory in 2017, my dominant learning style was imagining. And that tracked really well with how I saw myself: fairly introverted. I like to take a lot of time to process information, gain consensus, think it through. I don't like to be rushed into committing to a course of action before I feel ready. So very much inhabited this kind of right-hand quadrant. But in the ICU, I was galvanized to act. I was deeply immersed in an experience that I wasn't going to escape anytime soon, and in which I had very little control. But at the same time, I don't like to feel out of control, and so I was determined to make the best of it and not totally lose my independence. While I didn't think about learning cycles and learning theory, I did think very consciously, what can I learn from this situation? What does this experience want to teach me? Excuse me. So instinctively, I started the trip around the learning cycle, and it looked something like this. So in imagining, I'm thinking about what is possible. I can't control much, so what can I control? And the idea of practicing positivity started to emerge. In reflecting, well, what would that look like? That's when I remembered my conversation with Martha about my little army of white blood cells and starting with gratitude. So I kind of started with gratitude because it was something that I could seize on as a way to keep anxiety at bay and flip myself into kind of a more positive state of being. At the same time, it started calling up all of these ideas and learnings from grad school. I thought about David Cooperrider talking about looking for the bright spots, Richard Boyatzis's the positive and negative emotional attractors. And I really, really, really remembered Melvin Smith talking about looking at people with an appreciative eye. I remember members of my cohort talking about mindfulness and practicing mindfulness exercises and breathing. And I'm also at this time kind of thinking about how to minimize other distractions so I could try to focus on what I needed for my own little plan. So moving now into the thinking part of the cycle, I started trying to imagine what were the specific ways I could practice positivity, because I am no paragon of positivity and I don't like false positivity. So it had to be authentic. And that to me meant it had to be specific. I knew I had to turn my focus outside myself because nothing good was going to come from fixating on what I was going through. So I also wanted to respect the needs of my family, who were being incredibly attentive to my needs. And I knew I had to be practical about a lot of things, like having a family member around to be an advocate for me and trying to be cooperative for the nurses. So anyway, by the time I got to deciding, and I got to deciding really fast, this is all happening in a really short time. I worked out a plan with my family. I had my sisters, my daughter-in-law, my sister-in-law, who's also my best friend, taking shifts to help keep me company and be around to keep an eye on my care. My son had already cleared the decks at his law practice and was making himself available at the critical moments, like talking with the surgeon about the plan, talking to the insurance company, being around for moral support for mom. He was amazing. We put the word out to other family members about the volume and types of visits that I felt that I could manage. And so people really started like falling into the plan. In the meantime, my plan to practice positivity was very simple. I decided to look at everybody coming into my room with an appreciative eye. My plan was to try to find something unique and special about every soul who walked into my field of vision. So that required me to be observant. It required me to be curious. It required me not to think about myself, but to really try to think about other people. And it had to be specific and it had to be unique to the person. And I would try to notice these things, and it would lead me to have conversations with people. And the conversations turned out to be like surprisingly meaningful. It's something I'm not good at necessarily, to talk to people I don't know and have meaningful conversations with them. But once I settled on the strategy, I was finding the bright spots. I was creating the bright spots. The bright spots were walking into my room. It happened to be a really good hospital. I was getting incredible care. And I started noticing the things about the teams that were coming in that I got real curious about why these teams seemed so good. So I started noticing, the protocols that they observed every time they walked in the room, the consistency, the ways they introduced humanity in small ways. When you're gowned up and you're got an IV stuck in you, it can be kind of a dehumanizing experience. But what I noticed in this particular place, and it's not true of every place that I've seen either before and since, but when they came in the room, they looked me in the eyes, they introduced themselves. Somehow knowing their name made them seem more like a person and less like a job, and it made me feel more like a person and less like a condition. And so it was more like meeting them on an equal ground, and I didn't feel quite so vulnerable and out of control in that hospital gown. So I can't say it was the easiest week. I didn't get much sleep. It was hard to be cooped up, but my plan did keep the anxiety at bay. I had some amazing conversations, which we don't have time to go into here, but I remembered almost every name of every nurse that came in every 12 hours. By the time I got out of surgery and they came in to visit and see how I was doing, I was able to recognize almost all of them and greet them all by name. And I was so proud of my brain for being able to do that. But anyway, what was supposed to be about a 7-hour surgery took 4 hours. When I came to, I bounced out of anesthesia. My family heard me run in my mouth from the other room and was immediately relieved. I had no pain. The most I ever needed was 1 Tylenol for what felt like a mild toothache. I was fortunate in that the tumor was accessible from a part of my face and my brain that has very few pain receptors. So lots of things going in my favor. Brilliant surgeon, tons of support. I felt love bombed by the universe on Facebook. So results not typical. I moved through the learning cycle again during recovery, and I won't recount all those steps. But again, it was instinctive. It certainly wasn't planned. Again, it was accelerated. I think here my crisis communication training came into play. I, having worked for electric utilities, you plan for hurricane season, you plan for really tough things to happen, and you just snap to really quickly. You analyze information fast, you deal with what you have available to you, you make decisions, and you go. That's kind of the mode I was in, both when I was in the hospital and then when I was in recovery. I came out of surgery thinking I had one job, and that was to get better. I was just dismayed at being surrounded by sick people. And in fact, I think there are something like 40 beds in the ICU in that particular hospital. And the morning after my surgery, when the nurse came in, she said, "You're actually probably the least sick person on this floor, and you're doing so well. You're going to be the last to be seen during rounds." I'm like, I'm good with that. So I was lucky. I still had to observe the doctor's orders for taking it easy. That wasn't a very easy thing to do, but I did make a few decisions that, interestingly enough, when I look back, they were all decisions to learn more. I was eager to get back to work, but I had to wait a few more weeks. So in the meantime, I did three things. I signed up for an improv class, which is so unlike me. I didn't even think about it. I just got interested in the idea of it, and I decided to do it. The second thing I did is I signed up for a class in creative nonfiction. I am a writer, but I wanted this class to help me organize my thoughts. The requirement is that you produce a manuscript on some kind of creative nonfiction piece at the end. And so I saw this as a way to kind of force myself to go through the experience in a very orderly fashion, because I wanted to write about it. And then finally, I'm taking Kay Peterson's experiential learning certification course. And I just observe now that all of those decisions were in the direction of learning. I'm going to show a couple more slides, and then I would like to open this up and have you all talk about your experiences with learning. So when I got out, here I am with my fancy bandage, feeling pretty good. And this is the result of the KLSI that I took in March 2017. And the Kolb Learning Style Inventory, of course, is an assessment of your dominant learning style. This shows they call it the kite diagram, and it illustrates where I was at that time, very much in that space of imagining, reflecting, even analyzing, so living in that kind of quieter, introspective right-hand side of the learning cycle. To prepare for the certification course that I'm taking, the first thing we did is we took the KLSI again. And so I don't know if you can see it on my screen. There's some bars obscuring the other kite diagram, but in March 2019, so after the tumor experience, the kite shows a very significant shift. My learning style turned out to be experiencing, and much stronger shift over in the direction of acting. And I feel this, I really feel this change. And I feel the change brought on by what I've been through, what I learned, the sense of urgency coming out of that, having such a stark contrast between a life like really going down a dark hole and feeling pulled out of it just suddenly into the light. I mean, how many times do you get that kind of a contrast where you feel like you've gotten the second chance and you don't want to blow it? So all of this goes into a very strong motivation, a surprising, very strong desire to work and create. And so I take from all of this that I am a learner, and I am so enamored of being a learner that it's something I need to use the learning cycle to think through again. And this time I'm going to do it in a very intentional way. I'm asking myself these questions. I do feel like the change in me is pretty fundamental. I find myself much more outwardly focused. I am having conversations with strangers that I am not used to having. I'm quick to sign up for new experiences. I feel myself shifting in the kind of work I want to do. Before, when I first entered MPod, I was so excited at everything I was going to know when I came out. I thought I was going to have this cool bag of tricks. I was going to be such an awesome consultant. I was going to be knowing all this stuff, so people could hire me for all this stuff that I would be knowing. And I do remember the last assignment at MPod for Ron Fry's class, writing an essay on what I had taken away from the whole MPod experience. And what I said is, I learned it's not so much about knowing, it's about the learning. And that's where I am now. I learned that all over again. So this is for me. Embracing a learning orientation opens the world to me in ways that knowing never can. To me, learning is an open, generative process. It encourages me to approach people and situations with curiosity and interest. I'm more likely to find something to value. I'm less likely to judge. I do a lot more listening, and I'm pretty sure I'm a lot less annoying, but I have to work on it every day, because learning or knowing is kind of entrenched. And I know, I go in as a consultant, I'm expected to deliver value, and I have assumed that that means going in knowing. And yeah, I mean, it's important to know things, but there's a new way I feel like going about it, and that is to be more of a teacher, more of a capacity builder when I get in there, than getting in there, handing them something, and they still need me to implement it. I think now I'll be successful if I can get in there and teach them how to do it themselves and do myself out of a gig and on to the next one. So this is where I am. I think learning is where you'll find the most grace and positivity and all the best adventures and all the coolest people. And it is where you'll find the brightest moments in the darkest hours. So, getting a little emotional because it's a big deal for me. So I'd love to hear from you. What have you observed about your own learning style? How does it color how you approach your life and your work? And maybe you can think of a time when you took your own trip around the learning cycle, maybe intentionally, maybe not even realizing it, but where did it leave you? So kind of enough about me. I'd really love to hear from you.
Barbara.
Well, that was Andrew Ward.
Hi, and Andre.
While Andre figures out his interesting echoing habit, anyone that is on the phone, we usually like to go with you guys first because you guys haven't been able to see the PowerPoint. So if you can go ahead and unmute yourself, feel free to ask questions as you will. For anyone that wants to just write the question, you can use that chat box and I can sort of read your question back out to Barbara. So is there anyone else that's on the phone that would like to ask Barbara a question or leave a comment?
So hi, this is Janelle Coleman. I just was sort of struck, Barbara, by the change in the learning style that you that became your dominant style or your preference as you move through this experience. We recently did the KLSI for a client, and I retook my LSI so that I could get a sense of how things were looking on my end of late. And I used to be in that same space as you, in the imagining. I lived really heavily in the ideating, sort of thinking of things and experiencing the world. But since taking it 3.5 years ago, I started my own business and moved across the country. And I think a lot of those experiences have influenced my style to become more in the top left quadrant, which is much more about action, which seems to be where you moved as well. And so I think it's just interesting to see how, as we go through our lives and go through professional and personal experiences, the methods that we rely on for learning change. And I think it's just a really great example of needing to be dynamic and consistently really pay attention to being open to learning. And as long as we're open to it, really good, positive things can come our way. It's that your last point, I think, is so poignant. When we're focused on knowing the answer, it actually shuts down opportunity. So anyways, that's just my own little insight.
Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Janelle. I can see that. And one of the interesting things that we just covered in the course that I'm taking are the factors that influence a learning style. And of course, it's all the things that you're experiencing in your life. And I just love the fact that the learning cycle is so dynamic.
We have a chat question from Linda Wilkins. She says, Barbara, thank you for describing your learning journey. I work with process, technically oriented people. How would you distinguish the kind of true learning that you have described from the very common learning orientation that many people gravitate towards? And then in quotes, we just need more training. Let's train and check the box on this. What do you think?
Oh, I've gotten to the point where I even hate the word training. I can remember sitting in leadership training classes and having an instructor just talk at me for 4 hours and actually say things like, now write this down. I do recall some years later going through a change management certification and needing to bring change management training to a group of engineers. And before we rolled out this program to a broad number, we tested it on our toughest customers. So these were really smart finance people, engineering people. They tended to be, some of the toughest customers that we had. But we got them all in a room and we rolled out the training and they loved it. And I think the reason why they loved it is because it drew from their experience. It assumed that they had a lot of knowledge themselves, and the process was really generative in how it sought to coax it out of them and encourage them to share their ideas. So I landed on that model as a way when I am asked to go in and present information and try to teach people. I try to use that kind of an interactive process. I hope that helps. Somebody else might have another idea.
For those of you that are on a computer, you're more than welcome to, at any point at this stage, unmute yourself, and you can also turn on your video. I believe that when you turn on your video, it'll ask me to allow you to do so, and I will grant that. So feel free to communicate with Barbara in any way possible.
Barbara, it's Kay. And I love so many things about your story, but one point you illustrated so beautifully is this dynamic, the dynamism of the learning process and how you were transformed by learning. as you showed your KLSI, your previous KLSI, I was thinking, what if you would have been stuck in reflection throughout this whole process and just been a passive observer, taking in? And the fact that you went to action and you used both poles in so many ways, thinking and experiencing, acting and reflecting. I'm just thinking how different your story would have been if you would have skipped a step or left part of that cycle out. So it was just a beautiful portrayal of how we are transformed through learning.
Thank you, Kay. To me, it would have been unimaginable not to get to that point of action. In fact, and I think I wrote this in one of the early pieces for the course that we're taking, is it feels like a harvest. Mm-hmm. I've been this person that's been reflective and, kind of introspective and very much on that right-hand side, and coming up so strongly into the experiencing and the acting piece just feels like a harvest.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. Real integration.
Yes. Oh, my learning flexibility went up too. I should point that out. It's up near the top of the chart.
It sure is.
Hey, Barbara, this is Miriam. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Miriam.
Just the courage, really at every level, so moving. And I'm very curious about this place of embodied learning. So this practice that we talk about, in terms of active learning, but something about the embodiment of it. I was really struck by the practice you chose when you were in the hospital, and a lot of people could have tipped into that beyond the developmental edge into a danger zone and really shut down. But this place where you chose to focus intentionally and like just on one small activity of learning and appreciating. I mean, can you say more about that? I mean, that was and maybe it was embedded somewhat in from what Martha encouraged you to do, but that was quite striking to me.
I'll tell you, I had a long time boss and mentor. I worked with him in, 3 or 4 jobs. And the interesting thing about that working relationship is he's polar opposite from me in so many ways. And he would just drag me along to be his number 2 in these communication departments because we were so complementary. And I learned so much from him though. And he was a hard charger. So I learned how to do that. But he used to say that when you were trying to go after something, pick 3 things, no more than 3 things, because 2 is probably too few, 4 is too many. Anyone can remember 3. So I went into my action mode with the idea that I was going to find 3 specific things to do. But the thing that kept coming back to me was look at everybody with an appreciative eye. What did that look like? I felt like I had to just drill into it and be very specific for it to be meaningful. I thought if I just had some vague idea about being positive, that I would be all bravado and it would be false, and my family would be smart enough to see through it. And I also didn't want to BS myself that way. So that's why I decided to pick that particular practice, all about what is the specific thing I can do that will bring this to life. And then deciding to take an improv class like right after I'm allowed to drive, it was maybe the first place I drove to, was such an unusual thing for me, but it blended in so well with everything else I learned, because what improv does is it requires you to be in the moment. And before I took the class, I called a friend of mine who teaches theater in Atlanta, and I said, what tip can you offer me? I've read about the yes and. Improv wants you to say yes to your scene partner, and you're supposed to build on what they're giving you. You're supposed to work on it in the moment with them. And he said, just be attentive to your partner in the moment. Stay in the moment with them. Just be attentive to them. That's all you need to think about. That's such brilliant advice, because if I find myself practicing that, it liberates me from so many other things, and it makes me so much more in tune with that person. So I call on my little improv sessions all the time when I'm at work. I think that'll help with that whole embodiment idea too.
Thank you. Yeah, and that whole concept of relationship, I guess. So thank you for that. And the significance of relationship and being in the moment with others to broaden our learning trajectory. Anyway, so thank you.
Linda had a follow-up question in the chat. She said, I am wondering if as you gain time and distance from this experience, you might find yourself cycling around the learning cycle again with new insights and new kinds of integration. Do you see that happening?
Very consciously, Linda. Part of it is this course I'm taking. Part of it is this story that I'm writing. I am very consciously moving myself through the cycle again. I've got my questions all plotted out. Right now I'm probably in reflecting, but I do feel like I'm sifting through some choices already and throwing some alternatives out there for myself. But I am this time moving through the learning cycle with intention.
All right. Doesn't look like there are any more questions. Barbara, I just want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to give that presentation. I think I speak on behalf of everyone that we really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. For everyone that is still on the call, as you know, about 24 hours after these sessions conclude, there will be a link posted on YouTube, and Pat Petty will send that out to everybody. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop the recording. If for any reason you had a question that didn't get answered and you want to stay on after the recording is over, that's completely fine. And with that, I will stop the recording.